Hey guys, how's it going? It's Krista here, and today I'll be making a Happy New Year shaker card. To start off, I want to complete the background. I'll be using a piece of watercolor cardstock and distress watercolor pencils. And to start, I'll bring in some peacock feathers. I'm using a spray bottle to wet my brush, and I have not dampened the paper. I chose to use a spray bottle because I wanted to control the amount of water that I was using, and I haven't wet the paper previous to painting on it because I wanted to really control the blending. The more water that's on the cardstock, the more the pigments will blend together, and I wanted things to remain mostly separate with a little bit of blending. I don't have a clear idea of what I want this background to look like, but as I paint, I'm keeping in mind that I want kind of the theme of like swirling snow in the winter, and it's kind of really gusting in multiple directions. You can get those snow swirls, so I'm going for that as I paint. I'm keeping the tones mostly blue, bringing in now some salvage patina. The three things that I do know when I'm painting this background is I want it to represent the swirling snow. I want the entire background to be covered in pigment, and also I want the background to be mostly blue, in the blue tones. I'm working my way from my darkest blue to my lightest, finishing it off with some tumbled glass, also in the Distress watercolor pencil. And although this background is the longest part to complete, I haven't sped this up, and it still is a fairly quick background to create. And moving away from the blue tones, I'll start by bringing in some Villainous Potion in the Distress watercolor pencil. And I'm just kind of following the lines that I've already created with the other colors. I'm not concerned about cleaning the brush in between each color because I do want them to blend a little bit. And the last Distress watercolor pigment I'll be adding is the Picked Raspberry. And after I've added my picked raspberry, I realized there were things that I added that I didn't like, and that's okay. I just went over it with peacock feathers. I'm trying to add as much pigment as I can with each of the colors because I know as this background dries, it will lighten, and I would prefer it to be a little bit more saturated. Card front wouldn't be a card front without some perfect pearls, so I'm bringing in some perfect pearls in confetti white, and I really like how the pearl kind of makes this little starburst, or it can also be seen as a snowflake when it's added to a wet background on watercolor paper. And if the perfect pearl is added to a cardstock that's dry, it tends to form like more distinct splatters, and it doesn't spread out and blend with the ink as much as it does when it's wet. You can see it a little bit with the gold in the bottom left-hand corner, like that piece of the watercolor paper is dry, so they tend to stay in more circular kind of dots, whereas up top the cardstock is still wet, so it does move and spread out more. To set that, I'm just going to give it a quick pass with my heat tool, and I'm not going to dry it completely. I don't want to move the perfect pearl too much. I'll set that to finish drying on its own, and while it's drying, I want to start on the shaker portion of my card. I have Lawn Fawn Magic Iris Snowflake add-on die cuts, and I'm just going to run that through the die cut machine using glitter cardstock. And I could leave the little triangles in the snowflake, but I choose to just pop them out. But I like how with this die, it's an option to have a snowflake that's a little bit different if you want. And for the sentiment, I'm choosing Happy New Year from Lawn Fawn Magic Holiday Messages Clear Stamps. Before I stamp the image onto the piece of acetate with Versamark ink, I'm just rubbing it down with a little bit of rubbing alcohol, and I'm not using the paintbrush and my usual dryer sheet technique on the acetate because I find that it does leave a bit of a residue. I haven't tried it with a anti-static powder tool, but I found that just a little bit of rubbing alcohol just to clean up all this stuff works just as well on acetate. I'm using a stamp positioning tool, but I've also stamped onto acetate with an acrylic block and it does work, but you do have to be a little bit more cautious about to not squish it around. For embossing powder, I'm using Ranger white embossing powder. And to set that with my heat tool, I'm making sure that my heat tool is really nice and hot before I pass it over my acetate. And when I pass it over, I want to make sure that I'm not keeping the heat tool on the acetate for long periods of time. Even though it's heat resistant to a point, if I keep the heat tool on the acetate for long periods of time, it will warp it. This is a thicker acetate that I bought on Amazon. I got a great big pack of it, but Simon Says Stamp also has a package of heat resistant acetate that works well as well. To cut out the sentiment, I chose to use the Lawn Fawn Magic Messages Holiday Die Cut, the circle. If that's something that you don't have in your inventory, you could also use the snowflake that we used earlier. It provides the same size circle. The disadvantage to that is you will potentially be wasting some material getting the circle from the snowflake die. With this particular shaker card, I don't have the opportunity to create a lot of dimension. The front is acetate and there's nothing that I can use to really cover the top of the shaker to hide any dimension that I might create. So for this shaker, I'm just using a few gold stars. They're flat. They're from Recollections. I just picked them up at my local craft store. I like to use super glue when I'm working with any kind of paper that isn't smooth, like a glitter cardstock. I also like to use it when I'm working with acetate. And the third time that I like to use super glue is when it's anything structural, like I'm creating a box or any sort of pop-up card. Is it necessary? Possibly not. I just haven't found something that I prefer equally as well as the super glue. I want to cut the card front down a little bit because I want that matte of the glitter cardstock in the finished product. To do that, I'm using Lawn Fawn Outside In Stitched Rectangle Stackables die, and this is 5 1/4 by 4. With all of the components of the shaker card created, it's time to put them together. To find the alignment of where I want to put my shaker element, I definitely can get out a T-ruler and take measurements and do some math, but I'm just choosing to use my glass mat. I want to make sure that my card is kind of in the middle as possible, taking those bold lines on the x-axis and the y-axis where they meet in the middle as center, and lining up my card with one line on my glass mat. After placing down my shaker element, I'm taking the new and Happy New Year as the middle as center and lining the new up with the bold line on the x-axis and making sure that that E is hitting that y-axis as much as possible. And just to mark where I have it, I'll just mark it with a pencil just as a double check when I go to glue it down. After I've added adhesive to the shaker element, I can just plop it down into that circle, making sure that the word new, lines up with the bold line on the x-axis and the E is more or less lined up with the y-axis. And just as a double check, I'm taking a T-ruler just as a check for level that the words are straight. With the shaker element in place, I can add the snowflake portion, and I'm just taking a little bit of glue in a precision bottle and dotting it around each of the little points on the snowflakes and around the circle. For the mat, I will be making that a glitter cardstock today, and this is up to you. You can create a frame using 2 dies and taping them together, or you can use one. It's up to you, you do you. For this particular frame, I have Lawn Fawn large stitched rectangle stackable dies. The largest one, that's 5.5 by 4.25, and the Lawn Fawn outside in stitched rectangle stackables die set. And I don't have a measurement for this one. I just picked one that gave a thicker border to what I wanted. Next, I'll add the card front to the glitter mat that I created out of glitter cardstock, followed by adding the whole thing to a card base that is 5.5 by 4.25. And that completes the Happy New Year shaker card. Thank you so much for watching to the end of this video. See you next time. Bye for now.